out in the lands of danger and flame. Heroes of legend are making their name. Swords and spells with hearts full of zest, they ride with pride on a quest of interest. Heckfire Club, riding through the night. Heckfire Club, standing for what's right. Mystic lands and monsters to face, they're saving the world at a breakneck pace. From the Verdant province to Dragon's Lair, wicked wizards and trolls beware. With the rogue a knight and a mage so wise, they'll outwit danger and claim the prize. Legends told round campfire flames of secret spells and forgotten names. A hidden power, an ancient key, the fate of the realm is their destiny. Heckfire Club, riding through the night. Heckfire Club, standing for what's right. Curses, traps, and mysteries deep, no dragon's hoard is out of reach. They laugh at danger, they don't play it safe. Each wild adventure's a tale of interest, a caress. Heckfire Club, tales of interest.
We rejoin our party today, reformed outside the Velvet Fang Hotel, having pulled off an unthinkable 3 heists in a single wild night. The hotel, bank and manse were behind them, but they didn't wait to celebrate. Choices were made quickly: where to go, how to vanish before the net began to tighten. There was no consensus on a truly safe harbour. Some level of exhaustion was setting in, both in body and in mind. In their exchanges, it was suggested they head back to the Velvet Underground and try to find refuge with Ulma. It was a long shot, but also their best option, they decided, at finding a place to lay low. On the way, they made sure to see if they were followed. Celia remarked, thinking back to that young banker, that with invisible automatons stalking even the most secured and hidden passages, who could say where was safe anymore? The party agreed, but conceded they didn't have much of a choice. They descended into the quieter edges of the district, passing into the worn back alleys, where the lone sentry was still standing. There, half concealed by shadow and refuse, was that familiar set of fake crates just behind him. They spoke the password, brisket, and when the lone man finally glanced up, stone-faced, he eyed them considerately. Tension built up. The party stood still, waiting for something to happen. Finally, the sentry smiled and nodded as the hidden entrance creaked open behind him. The man they had left only hours ago stepped aside without comment, his expression somewhere between professional curiosity and weary amusement, making it clear even he welcomed them back sooner than expected. Descending under the colourful lanterns, they would seek once again the broken chain arena, and if they were lucky, find a friend in Ulma Irontooth. They kept their heads down as they moved through the lower tunnels, hoping the passerby crowds might work in their favour. They passed the Cindervale Market's entrance, where Zirath had seen Gertie, wearing a cloak fashioned from the flag of her people. He thought of everything he had learned so far: the bank's apparent dealings with the fleet of ships, the old families, his visions of the Field of Flames. Some of the answers he sought lay westward, and he would soon have to make a choice about his belonging to the group. The longer they walked, the more the tension pressed in and the thinner the crowds got. When they arrived, they found that the gates to the arena were shut. Heavy bars chain-locked from the inside. No sign of Ulma. No sound beyond the walls. Zora was the first to admit it. None of them had considered the possibility that she might not be here. Rather than hesitate, they vaulted the waist-high gate, quick and quiet, to head straight for the only door they remembered, the one Marlen had knocked before to rouse Ulma, albeit always at his own risk. Friz recounted dryly how Ulma tended to respond to interruptions. Zora agreed with a half-smile, but retorted they weren't in a position to be careful. Celia raised her hand and knocked. The only response was silence. She knocked again, and this time something inside stirred, metal sliding, wood shifting, the dull ring of ceramic against stone, thudding, slow steps, and then a slow creak. The door opened just enough to reveal a familiar silhouette framed by torchlight. Ulma Irontooth stood in the doorway, face marked with the creases of evident sleep, her expression unreadable. Zirath noticed that her armor was still on. By all appearances, the woman lived, worked, and indeed slept, ready for a fight. Ulma's gaze moved from face to face, everyone wearing an uncomfortable and, to her, clearly shifty grin. The arena master felt they looked like Marlin might, if he'd lost the champion's payroll and had come to confess. She didn't speak immediately and pondered at the dirty, exhausted and run-down misfits before her. Then, as she was watching them shift uncomfortably, she sighed, long and slow, and asked what, exactly, the idiots had done. The barbarian opened his mouth to speak, but she cut him off in true Ulma fashion, saying they'd better get inside. The room revealed itself as something far simpler than they'd imagined. There were no trophies, no lavish signs of the status Ulma commanded beneath Tannertown. Weapons hung along one wall, each mounted beneath a wooden placard etched with a name. Past masters of the broken chain honoured in silence. Near the end of the line, an empty mannequin stood, its frame shaped to hold armour that was conspicuously absent. Beside it, the final weapon, a vicious morning star, dark steel with the same storm-grey hues and crimson trim as the armour Ulma wore. It didn't glint. It absorbed light. Celia's eyes moved across the space with quiet appraisal. No personal comforts, no distraction. A cot in one corner, a desk with ink and scrap paper along the wall, and a low-burning hearth, cradling a pot of stew that turned slowly in the heat. It was largely ascetic, and focused for duty and purpose. Ulma dropped into the same chair she'd clearly been sleeping in, joints groaning quietly beneath the armour she never removed. She asked them again what they had done. The answer came slowly, fragmented at first, each voice adding a piece to the whole. Through it all, Ulma said nothing. Her expression gave away even less. She remained perfectly still, only occasionally shifting her attention between speakers. The room was quiet enough that the crack of the fire and the soft bubbling of the stew carried like thunder. Zirath made note of her uncharacteristic silence. Her words usually hit fast, hit hard, and hit often. The paladin suspected her combat style might be much the same. They kept unfolding the events, and then someone said his name. Thaddeus Flint. That earned a shift in posture, a flicker behind the eyes. It passed quickly, but the room noticed. They finished the story. The velvet sweets, the ledgers, the blood debts, and forged tax routes. The gold marked for extraction. They ended on silence. Ulma leaned back, one gauntlet resting on the arm of her chair, the other drumming lightly against her knee. Her eyes never left them. She asked them, quiet, deliberate, what exactly it was they wanted from her. They asked her plainly if she might help, and it wasn't posed as a demand or plea, but something heavier than either. A request shaped by exhaustion and the quiet urgency of people who had seen too much. The kind of ask that did not carry entitlement, only consequence. Ulma said nothing at first. Her eyes lingered on each of them, taking in the subtle shifts, the weariness in their posture, the tension still coiled in their shoulders. She didn't interrupt, and listened. Though still, Ulma couldn't shake the concern that if the Heckfire Club had begun to worry, then perhaps the balance above was more fragile than she'd thought. The surface world could fracture in its own chaos, but the pressure always found a way to reach the foundations. Eventually it would reach the underground. It always did, in some way. When she finally spoke, her tone returned to something more familiar. Wry, measured, and wholly hers. She offered them rest. The arena would be safe tonight. She would see to that personally. Whatever lurked above, whatever moved behind the veil of gold and ledgers, would not touch them here. Turning an eye toward them, she mentioned to no one in particular that the broken chain still had its baths in the challengers' halls. The remark passed without further comment, though its implication lingered in the air. The Heckfire Club shifted and avoided eye contact. It nearly made her smile. But anonymity and a long rest for the night ahead, she said, would be her limit. She walked across the room with her usual purpose, stopping at a wall-mounted lance edged with a long, curved blade. She nodded to it as she walked toward the Morning Star. Her oath, she reminded them, was not to crowns or councils, nor to noble names or buried secrets. It was to the arena. The arena had broken her chains once, and her oath would be kept. The broken chain had stood longer than any throne in Verdun, longer than any bank, any merchant council. The underground had endured. It would endure still. Her fingers brushed the haft of her old weapon with an unspoken affection, and she lifted it off its holster, eyeing the savage-looking Morning Star. Ulma admitted she felt a great swell of pity for anyone who might come into her arena, looking for trouble. The battlemaster said no more as she led them down into the challengers' hall. Once they were inside, she closed the door behind them, placing herself on guard between the party and whatever remained above. Weapon in hand, she wished them a night's peace and the protection of the gods, from whatever might manage to get past her. The adventurers found some cots, lit a small brazier, and dove into a long, restful sleep. It was mid-morning when they woke, and the air was still warm with embers from a kept fire. The hall was quiet. They opened the door to find two attendants sweeping the nearby stone floors, neither of which looked up. Whether their silence came from fear, habit, or deliberate avoidance of Ulma's private business, it served the adventurers well enough. Ulma was nowhere in sight, nor did the party look for her. Whatever unspoken truce they had with the arena master, they weren't eager to press its boundaries. Outside, they debated their next step. Thomas suggested the drowned lyre. Bards always knew something, even if they sang it sideways. Someone else floated the Cinder Vale market. But in the end, the choice came down to clarity, which also was not likely found at the Silk Fang Lounge. In the end, they chose to visit once more the altar of the Unbound, to seek out again the brother Malkesh. If there were answers to be had, they figured they might convince the fallen cleric of more dark divination. The lower halls which led to the altar had a rhythm of their own, and no one paid them any real notice. The unwritten rule obeyed by all in this place, as the adventurers had so far discovered, was no questions asked. The Velvet Underground was a place built on true personal freedom, for better or for worse. As they reached the carved stone passage that led to the altar, they slowed. Around the next bend, footsteps echoed, and he came into view. Moving straight toward them with purposeful efficiency was none other than Thaddeus Flint. Thankfully, none of them froze, but something locked and twisted inside each of them. His gaze was fixed ahead, expression unreadable. Slung over his shoulder was a long, heavy bundle wrapped in coarse burlap. The adventurers' minds were ablaze with the implications of what they were seeing. He passed without a word or glance their way. To their collective insight, he'd betrayed no recognition. Just movement, which should have put them at ease. But he had come from the altar, and that, more than anything else, made the group uneasy. Friz and Thomas exchanged a brief look in understanding. The group stepped forward nonetheless and entered the domain of the brother Malkesh. The sanctuary of the Unbound was as they'd left it just the day before. 100 deities and idols lined the room, lit by all manner of strange, colour-flamed candles. A few hooded worshippers prayed, performed strange rites, or yelled dirges in languages unknown to any of them. Inside the altar chamber, they found Brother Malkesh collapsed near the base of his stone dais, his form racked with tremors. The flickering torchlight cast his outline in harsh relief. He did not turn nor rise, but greeted them all the same, his voice cracking with the effort. Once again, without looking in their direction or any of them speaking, Malkesh knew exactly who had entered his hall. He apologized for his condition, voice steady despite the pain. Communion with the dead, he explained, took a great toll on him, His words trailed off into prayers and fragments of thanks, whispered as though to keep the pain at bay. Thomas and Friz exchanged a glance. No words passed between them, but both understood. Zirath felt a kind of respect for Flint, admitting to himself not even death would be enough to stop someone like him from getting the answers he wanted. Celia stepped forward, unsure whether kindness or strategy moved her more. She offered to heal him. The gesture came with sincerity, but also a hope that such mercy might yield information. Malkesh refused. His body, he said, bore a debt. Healing would not erase it. His tone left little room for protest. Thomas made his move then. He opened his coat, revealing the weight of gold inside. The offer didn't need to be spoken. Zora shook his head. As to him, this was a holy man in his own strange way. But Malkesh responded anyway, seeing the unseen and unspoken. Still facing away, still motionless, he reminded them of the covenant. He was an ordained brother. What had been asked of him within the bounds of confessional would remain sealed, as said Malkesh. All were welcome into his congregation. Friz bristled. The mechanics of his sight, his ability, were unlike any magic she knew. She said nothing, but her mind tore through arcane possibilities, grasping at theories that refused to take shape. Zirath stepped forward. His voice was low, steady. He spoke not as warrior, but as something else, someone bound by oath and tempered by belief. He reminded the brother kindly that they had come by the guidance of the Phantom himself, that their need was not curiosity but mandate, and that whatever vows Malkesh had taken, they stood now in the shadow of something older, deeper, and by its nature, sacred. There was a stillness that followed. Even the torches seemed to burn quieter. The others watched, uncertain whether to be awed or unsettled. Zirath had always been a figure of discipline, but this was something else. Authority, presence, a subtle invocation of something regal. Malkesh did not speak immediately, but when he did move, it was with care. He rose to his feet slowly, turned his face toward Zirath, milky eyes sightless, but unerring, and inhaled deeply, as though scenting the truth in the paladin's words. Then he exhaled. He offered only one thing, that the Dragonborn's visage had not been discussed. Pain seized him mid-sentence. He dropped to the ground, hands clawing toward the altar, voice breaking as he begged them for leave. He needed rest, he said, and to the others it was ever more clear. Zora knelt beside him and pressed a gold piece into his shaking hand, a gesture not of payment, but offering. The altar was clean, ordered in its own way, but in a sorry state overall. The priest accepted it with a nod and sincere, humbled thanks. Then, with a surprising clarity, he reached into his robes and produced a massive pouch. He added Zora's contribution to a shockingly full purse, as if placing it among 1,000 old companions. At the sight of the giant gold pouch, the group stood slack-jawed, remembering suddenly this was exactly how business was carried in the underground. As the group walked out, Thomas allowed himself a final remark, pitched just loud enough to carry over his shoulder, telling no one in particular he absolutely knew a bribe would have worked. They left the altar and decided to find one more possible ally this far in the east. His laboratory, according to his map, was a half-day's march from the city. They emerged from the velvet underground just as Tannertown's streets, once hushed, had begun to stir with the rhythm of daily trade. Vendors opened stalls. Labourers moved with quiet urgency. They chose their path carefully, sticking to the edges, slipping through alleys and making for the southern exit. There were no gates. Tannertown didn't need them. The plains served as both shield and sentry, stretching in all directions, unbroken and brutally open. There was nothing to hide behind here, just wind and wheat and the long watch of the sky. They followed a path charted by the tinker's directions, lines and angles inked hastily by Shelbert Colbra during their last encounter. Friz compared it to her own maps, those old diagrams of fallen settlements. The match was precise. The ruins lay at the southern tip of what had once been a tinker stronghold. They made the journey in silence, a half-day's walk across open fields. No ambushes, no watchers. The breeze was steady, and the sun climbed slowly overhead, but the urgency never left them. The tourney was now 3 days away. Every hour mattered. Eventually, the shape on the horizon began to define itself. What had first looked like boulders, weathered and overgrown, resolved into something far more deliberate. Metal, not stone, shaped with intention. The surfaces bore scars of time and violence, bent girders, collapsed supports, the remnants of structures long buried beneath wind and season. Near the centre they found a trapdoor, clean, reinforced, and markedly newer than its surroundings. Looking at each other, and collectively shrugging, they knocked. The response came through the steel plating, magnified by thaumaturgical magic. Shelbert's voice, distorted only slightly by the mechanism. He asked who approached, the tone casual and curious. Friz answered. No hesitation. A series of locks disengaged from within, clicks, slides, and the faint whir of something mechanical, and the door creaked open. They descended a makeshift ladder, its frame a patchwork of iron braces and worn timber, clearly repaired more than once. The passage narrowed quickly, forcing Zirath and Zora to twist their shoulders to pass. The air grew cooler, drier. Their boots touched down on steel, the clang echoing faintly in the enclosed space. The walls around them were stone, smooth, fitted, and clearly part of something old, reinforced with newer plating, held by bent old beams of steel. At the far end of the corridor, Shelbert Culbra stood waiting. His goggles clicked with satisfaction as lenses snapped into place. He beamed. He told them he was thrilled to see them, and with more excitement than caution, announced that he had something to show them. The Master Tinker welcomed them into his lab with the proud energy of a man convinced he was about to change the world and also possibly blow it up. The chamber opened into a wide octagonal space bristling with workbenches, suspended gears, and a ceiling so covered in pulleys and cabling it looked like someone had tried to win a bet involving rope. Metal fragments lined every shelf. Elven alloys, dwarven reinforcements, orcish plating twisted into unnatural curves. The whole place thrummed with activity. 100 small machines clattered, rang, steamed, or spat. Bells chimed in erratic intervals. One contraption near the wall appeared to be manufacturing its own frustration, puffing out smoke with a sound not unlike a sigh. Culbra beamed. He waved at the chaos with a sweep of his arm and proudly announced his Deceleratrix collection. One of the finest in living memory, he claimed. Celia offered a polite noise that could be interpreted as admiration. She didn't ask what a Deceleratrix was, and was fairly certain she wouldn't understand anyway. Zirath reached for a small silver machine that was rhythmically spitting out bursts of violet vapour. It looked oddly inviting. Culbra turned with sudden clarity and shouted for him not to touch it, his voice higher pitched than usual, his urgency seizing. The party froze, turned to Zirath, and the paladin pulled his hand back without comment. Culbra recovered quickly, brushing off the moment with professional poise. For a moment, he'd looked genuinely afraid of whatever the contraption was. Zora wondered just what in the hells the Tinker kept within arm's reach or accidental nudge, but followed him nonetheless. Zora couldn't help but feel like a bull in a china shop. He clapped his hands together, visibly excited, and said he had something truly special to show them. From his coat pocket, he produced the small brass beetle he'd purchased from Thomas. It clicked faintly, legs ticking in mechanical rhythm. He placed it carefully on the floor and stepped back. Then he asked them to also step back, and they obliged. Then he asked again. And then, once more, just to be safe. Eventually, when everyone was standing what felt like an unreasonable distance from the thing, Culbra adjusted his goggles and pulled a device from his belt. He flicked a switch. A soft whirring sound quickly escalated into something that could only be described as a mechanical scream. With a violent surge of arcane transformation, the beetle snapped open, expanded outward, and unfolded into a towering metallic siege beast. Joints snapped into place with the grinding weight of a battering ram. Pincers longer than a man's arm clashed with crushing force, sending a gust of displaced air, and at least one nearby table flying. The adventurers scattered instinctively. Friz shouted something, most likely a demand for immediate deactivation, but no one could hear her over the 3-ton death choir of shrieking gears and twisting steel. Culbra, still laughing with something between pride and mania, turned back to the machine and shouted that he would now, yes, turn it off. He flicked the switch again. With a puff of smoke and a hydraulic sigh, the monstrosity collapsed in on itself and returned to its harmless beetle shape, sitting motionless and smug at the centre of the now half-destroyed lab. The group took a moment to assess the damage. Several gears were embedded in the walls. 2 benches had been shattered. Something continued to spark in the corner. Culbra turned to them, still grinning, and asked if they were impressed. The silence that followed was not entirely out of disagreement. Before the last gear had finished rolling across the floor, Friz was already speaking. 3 questions launched in rapid succession. How he'd stabilized the magical frame during expansion, how the components didn't shear under the strain, and what kind of arcane core could manage an enlarge and shrink spell with enchanted moving parts. Her hands were already sketching symbols in the air, her mind a dozen steps ahead, chasing implications most wizards only read about. Culbra blinked once, twice, then grinned with something approaching genuine respect. He leaned forward slightly, squinting behind the whirring lenses of his goggles, and said she was asking all the right questions. Then he winked and added that he might, just might, be open to taking on an apprentice. No promises, of course. Friz muttered something about non-standard gear stabilizers and continued taking mental notes. She didn't acknowledge the offer, but seemed to Celia confused about how something worked, which was exceedingly rare. Culbra did clarify one key detail. The beetle, now dormant again on the lab floor, could expand, yes, destroy, of course, and quite spectacularly. But it couldn't move. Not yet. To animate it, he said, he would need a MacGuffin gear. The way he said it made it sound like legend, and in truth, for his following explanation, it nearly was. He explained casually that MacGuffin gears hadn't been manufactured in at least 7 generations. No blueprint remained. No reliable source of the original alloy had been identified. Most tinkers believed them lost to war and time. Zora folded his arms, already sensing the direction this was heading. Culbra turned to him with an almost theatrical seriousness. He hadn't forgotten the promise. A weapon, crafted to Zora's strength, something worthy of a warrior's fury. And the Master Tinker would absolutely honour that pledge, earnestly. He apparently just needed one small, ancient, impossibly rare mechanical artifact. Maybe 2, and 3 would definitely help. The group exchanged glances, unsurprised at the transaction unfolding. Culbra, ever the optimist, raised a finger. Unlike his fellow tinkers, wherever they'd run off to or exploded, he knew where at least one could be found, possibly intact. Definitely dangerous, but probably, yes, findable. He was nearly sure. The gnome beckoned them to follow down an older hall, wide enough for 2 carts to roll down. Steam jutted from pipes, each hiss and creak echoing through the narrow corridors like a ghost of old industry. They ran like veins through stone and metal, their pulse steady, humming just beneath the threshold of hearing. Culbra led the way, his gloved fingers brushing the wall, tracing grooves invisible to the untrained eye. The others followed close, their boots careful on the grated flooring, weapons ready but undrawn. Zora glanced up at the dark struts above. Thomas kept his hands near his coat. Friz paused every few steps to sketch something. Zirath walked without fear, as always, but with a wary kind of silence. Celia walked, but barely made a sound against the steel flooring. They reached a fractured archway set into the hall. Above it, a mural, etched into tile and worn with age, depicted a ring of arms, each one holding a different tool. Culbra stopped there. He stared at the mural as if seeing it for the first time in years. Celia, seeing the important to the gnome, asked what this place was and where they'd been brought. Culbra didn't turn. Instead, his voice carried back softly, telling the sharp-eyed monk that this wasn't just a ruin. It was the last stronghold of the Tinker Empire. The final bastion of the Tinker-Artificer War, sealed before the end. Not a lab, not a vault, a refuge deliberately preserved. On he went, and they followed, ducking their heads under the odd low pipeworks. At first, said Culbra, the Tinker constructs were winning. Faster minds, smarter steel, machines that could repair themselves mid-battle and learn from failure. Tinker walkers outpaced artificed elementals, and for a time the dwarves fell back behind their stone gates. Walking further down into tunnels, there was no longer any sign of Culbra's habitation. It was a walk down history, noted Frizz, still drawing schematics and diagrams in her journal. Zora asked what brought the end. If the Empire had such strength, such defences, why had it fallen? This time Culbra turned. At the apex of the war, he stated, they changed the rules. Something new marched down from the dwarven holds. Silent things, unified, perfect in their malice. They moved like one mind, not as an army, but as a single vengeance given form. With gleaming runes humming like ancient prayers to some forgotten forge god. The teachings, said Culbra, said they thought together, killed together. The Tinkers called them the soul-bound. The dwarves called them justice. Zora, Frizz, Thomas, Zirath, and even Celia had seen them firsthand. The hordes of Karzak, the artificer, now unnamed into the Tower of Deadlaw. Frizz stepped closer, scanning the arch with her fingers, noting the sigils etched into the gears were unfamiliar to her. Not guildwork, she deduced, but seemed older. Culbra confirmed it, calling it thread script, part code, part gnomish, part enchantment, used only by the founders. Rare now. He doubted more than a handful could still read it, himself included. Thomas, curious, asked how he knew. Culbra offered no explanation and only continued. 3 bastions fell in days, not battles, erasures. And then, when the dwarves had reached south, without a final push or claim of victory, they simply stopped. A lone envoy had been sent after years of war. A single treaty was signed with no conditions, just silence. Frizz, still studying the wall, asked if this place was a tomb. Culbra didn't answer directly. He called it a heartbeat, a memory of something greater, waiting for someone foolish or brave enough to restart it. He reached into his coat and produced a flickering brass wrench. Runes pulsed along its edge, soft and slow like a sleeping pulse. He tossed it gently to Zora. When they had reached the end of the hallway, Culbra simply said he'd need that to extract the MacGuffin gears from something he called bendy benders. Frizz was the first to speak again, still caught between awe and caution. She asked what exactly a bendy bender was, recalling both the smashy smasher in the arena and the brass beetle that had nearly destroyed a room full of Tinker heirlooms. Culbra's tone shifted at once. There was reverence in his voice as he leaned over a pile of tools and adjusted a brass monocle that clicked into place with a whisper of focused magic. The bendy benders, he explained, were towering constructs from the height of the Tinker Empire, masterfully engineered to bend steel girders by hand, used to build the very framework of the underground cities. Most had vanished after the collapse, torn apart in battle or sealed behind forgotten vaults. If, however, the party could find one and, more miraculously, get it onto its chest, he could salvage the MacGuffin gearboxes embedded in their back shoulder plating. With just a few of those, paired with the elemental core Frizz still carried, Culbra said he could craft something extraordinary. A weapon worthy of Zora's hands. Or, if the mood struck him toward madness, he could repurpose the little brass beetle into a one-shot siege engine. Either way, he promised, it would be beautiful. And loud. But Frizz wasn't finished. She reached into her satchel and pulled free the old Tinker map they had taken from the library in the Skinner's manse. Unfurling it just long enough for the lines and sigils to catch the light, She let Culbra see what she had. He gasped. His goggles dropped into place with a hiss of steam. She rolled it back up immediately and laid out her terms. She had 2 sealed ledgers from Harken Bank, tinker-locked, encoded, likely impenetrable to any non-artificer alive. And he, Shelbert Culbra, was a master tinker. Surely, for someone of his skills, opening 2 ledgers would be trivial. She called it a fair exchange, a priceless map of lost settlements for a mere crack at 2 ledgers. There was a pause. For the first time since meeting him, Shelbert Culbra appeared fully, utterly defeated in a negotiation. The group stood silent. Zora blinked. Thomas looked quietly impressed. Zirath gave a small nod of approval. Even Culbra himself had to concede, lifting his hands in surrender. He agreed, offered his hand to Friz, and asked one final time whether she was absolutely sure she wasn't interested in an apprenticeship. Friz didn't respond aloud, but her pride was evidenced by the grin she was wearing. Still, it was Culbra who had the last word, as he threw open a steel-reinforced hatch in the floor, leading into the deeper ruins of the Tinker complex. He casually mentioned there might still be a few leftover defences down there. Nothing too excessive, of course, but a deal, he said, was a deal. They descended into the ruin. It was cold but not dead. The architecture, even in decay, spoke to brilliance. Stone and steel and steam intertwined with purpose. Every wall, strut, down to the decorations bore evidence of intent. This place had not been carved, it had been assembled. Some lights still flickered, old crystal torches embedded in conduits, sputtering to life after untold centuries. They cast pale beams across empty halls, framing the dust in strange, artificial halos. The group stepped into a massive chamber, a gathering place, clearly, once a plaza of sorts. Pipes and arches ran overhead, some snapped, others warped. Machines lay in twisted heaps, their surfaces scorched or corroded. Among the ruin, fragments glinted, silver, gold, chrome, bright red. The silver and gold ones drew the party's attention first. They recognized them. Karzak's hordes. Zora stopped short. His eyes lingered on one broken helm, cracked open like a skull. He remembered Alistar, the loss of him, the weight of it. Nearby, Celia froze at the sight of a crushed chassis, her thoughts returning to Saffron Sands, to the wreckage left behind by a machine sent not to conquer, but to find. It had been hunting Zora, and this then companions. She hadn't forgotten the bodies and destruction it left in its wake. They searched through the wreckage, but the machines were long past purpose, torn apart, twisted under immense force. Beyond the plaza, most hallways were collapsed. Rubble sealed passage after passage. Friz considered how far this complex must stretch underground. No map could capture this. They chose one open path and moved forward. The corridor narrowed, lit only by their own spells and the flickering remnants of light. Red, yellow, and blue pipes lined the walls, some fused into place, others sagging. Faint glyphs dotted the metal between girders. Worn down, half unreadable. Zirath paused, resting a gauntlet on one of the bent girders. Whatever had crushed this steel hadn't done it gently. They were still discussing possibilities when they reached the next room. Steam hissed from pressure valves. 3 enormous wheels turned slowly, each a cog in a greater unseen system. Some pipes vented heat, others chilled the air. A coolant pump groaned somewhere deep in the walls. But something was off. Not all the wheels were turning. Friz spotted the problem first. Massive chunks of steel jammed into key points of the machinery. The floor was littered with small crates, blue, red, yellow, all metallic, all uniform, same colours as the pipes. Friz approached a red one. It detonated. A fireball surged outward. Her shield spell caught most of it, but the surprise was complete. Everyone froze, no movement, no approach. They resorted to testing, objects thrown, mage hand summoned, each attempt failing to trigger any effect. Then Thomas, in a final test, sent his familiar, a spectral owl, into a blue box. The explosion this time wasn't fire, and it was ice. The owl froze mid-flight, its feathers encased in a sheet of frost. The ice spread to the machinery nearby, locking one of the key gears they needed. Frizz considered the pattern, some sort of life detection spell, triggering only on living presence. Zirath agreed. Soulbound automatons would therefore set them off, but Tinker constructs would not. It was, Zirath admitted, a clever turn of siege warfare. The group adjusted their approach and carefully they began to work. Ropes replaced hands. Boxes were pulled from a distance, but not always successfully. One yellow crate discharged a bolt of lightning that caught Zora square in the chest before he could roll aside. The shock left him winded but upright. Still, they pushed on. Through slow coordination and a good deal of cursing, they cleared a path to the frozen gear. Then, with no small amount of risk, they used some clever teamwork to hurl and detonate a firebox toward it. The explosion was violent but effective. Ice melted. Steel shuddered free. And Frizz's lizard familiar, the aptly named Liz, was instantly vaporized. They repeated the process, deliberate, synchronized, until all 3 gears were cleared. The room groaned, steam shifted, machinery awakened as the wheels began to turn again after thousands of years of silence. Somewhere in the ruin, beyond the walls, other machines responded with noise. As they made their way out of the chamber, soot-smudged and bruised, Celia turned back toward the hissing pipes, the turning gears, and the blinking lights now reawakening behind them. She wondered aloud what exactly they had just done. Next, the adventurers followed the yellow pipes. The gears they had freed were moving now, so something, somewhere, must have activated. That was the hope, at least. The yellow conduits ran from the steam room and into another corridor, narrower and steeper. The party moved with caution, their eyes scanning the walls, their ears tuned to the faintest sound. What they heard was not what they expected. At first it was just a vibration, a resonance that barely registered. But the closer they came to the next chamber, the clearer it became. Music, more specifically, singing. And not just one voice, several. Melodic, rhythmic, unmistakably mechanical. The adventurers slowed their pace, drawing in toward the wall, weapons ready. As they approached the next chamber, they moved behind a collapsed girder and peered over the rubble. And what they saw didn't make any sense. 3 alcoves sat at the far end of the room. Yellow pipes fed directly into each one. Debris and shattered components were strewn across the chamber. Yet among the wreckage moved 3 small machines, distinctly coloured red, yellow and blue, sweeping, sorting, organising rubble with impossible positivity and merriment. And the singing to Frizz was downright adorable. Each voice chimed in harmony with the others, repeating a strangely upbeat chorus about helping, sorting, sweeping, and something about their love to sweep and clean and fix and sing. Their brass chassis shone beneath layers of accumulated grime, and as they worked, they called themselves Helpy Helpers. The 3 machines continued their cheery anthem, apparently oblivious to the heavily armed party watching them from behind a crumpled support beam. It was Frizz who broke the silence as she stood, waved once and said hello. They turned, paused a beat and sang.
Hey! We fix the gears and scrub the floor. We tighten bolts and oil the door. We sweep and sort until the end. 'Cause healthy helpers like to help. We patch the walls and paint the cracks. We file files and clean the tracks. We store the tools upon the shelf. 'Cause healthy helpers like to help. It's Horace tempted defense mode engaged. We twist the neck and gouge the eyes. We hear the lovely screaming cries. We snip and stab and crush with glee. A healthy helper killing spree. So run and hide, you sneaky pests. We'll hollow out your squishy chests. We're tidy, clean, and built to gore. Healthy helpers help win the war. Just ring into the swing into ring. Swing into ring. Swing into ring. Oh, let's swing into ring. Swing into ring. Just swing into ring. Oh, let's swing into ring.
The fight with the Helpy Helpers had been unexpectedly brutal. Their cheerful chorus had twisted mid-battle into shrill, clanging declarations of duty and destruction, and what had once been innocent repair functions were now devastating weapons. Flamethrowers meant to fuse steel became searing bursts of suppressive fire. Hydraulic crushers adapted to break stone could just as easily shatter bone, and shock tethers designed to restart arcane gearworks fired bolts of lightning. It was, if nothing else, a grim reminder that every mechanism in the ruin, no matter how charming its purpose once was, could be retooled for war. They had, from the blue Helpy Helper, managed to extract some of the ice canisters he'd been lobbing at the party from behind cover. Another repurposing, the inscriptions and glyphs on the canisters indicated they were designed for fire safety. They advanced with sharpened caution, following signs of destruction that grew heavier with every step. Mangled silver and gold chassis littered the path, some fused to scorched flooring, others shattered against walls streaked with carbon and rust. Eventually, the debris gave way to a barricade. Half walls, half rubble, all piled to seal off a narrower hall. Behind it, the carnage continued. Twisted limbs, cracked faceplates, scattered glyphs half-burned into unrecognizable shapes. It was there they heard the voice. Distorted and broken, it echoed through the hall with a tone that hovered between mechanical logic and something more fragile. It spoke in halting common, its accent guttural and strained, and its first question was simple. Is someone there? Weapons were drawn instantly, the party falling into formation, with a silent efficiency born of too many ambushes. Zora led, his sword already in hand, the cursed gauntlet flexing against his grip. Thomas scanned the ruin carefully, and it was he who spotted the source. Beneath a collapsed steel girder and a blanket of stone, a single blue eye glowed dimly from behind a cracked silver faceplate, flickering like a star behind smoke. The voice repeated its plea, quieter now, laced with static and desperation. Please. Help. Zora asked who was speaking, his words measured and unflinching, though his fingers tightened around the hilt of his blade. The eye dimmed, then brightened. The answers came slowly, and the adventurer's questions revealed new light on Karzak's dark designs. The voice belonged to Priv of the Atrian family forge, once a lava trench digger, conscripted into war. He had not been born to riches, only to hard labour, but the promises had come all the same. Glory for the dwarven cause, meals and apprenticeships for those who volunteered, and perhaps a future no longer built from soot and exhaustion. He had believed them. Thousands had. Priv could no longer recall the artificer's name, but he remembered the fear it carried and how quickly the promises crumbled. Under his hand, he was remade. Flesh into iron, will into obedience. He became soul-bound, part of the war-forged collective that marched without rest, killed without hesitation, and obeyed without thought. Zora remembered the feeling he'd felt in Karzak's final lair when the Soul Forge had tried to take over his mind. He'd resisted, but the boys, or machines, way of describing it, stirred the familiar hatred. The voice Karzak's intrusive hive mind had told him to kill his friends. He focused back on the soulbound, whose voice continued. Nearly a year ago, said the pinned construct, he'd felt the control over him suddenly sever. Commands ceased. No orders came. There was no death, only stasis buried beneath the stone. And so Priv waited, entombed in silence and dust. Over time something shifted, the binding weakened, and his identity had returned. There was no clarity in it, no triumph, just the slow, agonizing awareness of what he was, what he had been made to do, and what he no longer could be. Now, his voice fractured under the weight of his own request. He did not ask to be fixed. He did not ask to be remembered. He asked only, begging, to be unmade. Celia stepped forward, light gathering faintly in her palms, her divine senses reaching instinctively for healing. But as she drew closer, she stopped. She shook her head once, the glow in her hands dissipating. This was beyond her arts. Zirath stepped past her, saying nothing. He drew Dorf's hammer with quiet ceremony, its weight familiar in his hand, and approached the shattered form of the digger. He did not bless the act. He did not offer words of judgment or salvation. He knelt instead so that the dying blue light could meet him directly, and held that gaze for a long breath. Then he brought the hammer down, and there was no scream before the hit. Only silence followed the true strike, and the faint extinguishing of the last light in Privs the trench digger's eye. They left his body where it had fallen, half buried in stone and surrounded by the wreckage of a war no one had won. Celia lingered at the threshold, her gaze sweeping the corridor that lay ahead. She wondered aloud, voice low and uncertain, if others like Priv had awakened since Karzak's destruction, others elsewhere, unaware that the war was over. No one answered her, and she didn't press the thought further. They moved on in silence. The deeper they pressed, the clearer the story became. More fortifications marked the halls, hastily constructed barricades built from rebar, reinforced plating, even collapsed gearworks. Blast marks scorched the walls, and deep gouges in the stone showed where something massive had clawed or rammed its way through. Every step confirmed the same conclusion. This was the end. The last line. The halls twisted ahead, tight and uneven. Then came the smell. Acrid chemical, sharp enough to sting. They knew better than to rush. The tunnel opened into a broad chamber, once symmetrical, once engineered with care. But now the floor had collapsed entirely. A roiling chasm stretched out below, framed by broken struts and crumbled pathways. Across it a narrow passage remained, impossibly narrow, a twisting series of bolted pipes lashed together like an emergency maintenance bridge. It looked passable. For gnomes. Thomas stepped to the edge and peered down. What he saw below was not encouraging. With all the sarcasm his lungs could afford, he asked aloud whether the boiling, reeking mess was in fact a river of molten acid. It was. The coolant had leaked from shattered conduits, its contents warped by heat and pressure, until it became a sloshing, toxic soup that filled the room below. Whatever had fallen into it, soul-bound or otherwise, was gone. They realized quickly this had been deliberate, a final failsafe. If the enemy breached the gates, the gnomes would take the floor with them. What they couldn't stop, they would dissolve. It was tempting to declare the end of the line. Every instinct said to turn back. But they didn't. Celia stepped forward. With a quiet breath, she called upon her celestial bloodline, wings of light flaring from her back in soft radiance. Without fanfare, she lifted Frizz and carried her across, feet gliding just inches above the pipe bridge. Zora's approach was less elegant. Frizz cast the jump spell on him, muttering a quick set of syllables under her breath. With a snarl, Zora summoned the rage that gave his body strength, and swept Thomas up under one arm. He leapt, clearing the distance with a crash of boots on metal, steam rising in angry bursts around them. Zirath, far too large for the narrow bridge in his current state, waited. Frizz turned again, incanted the reduce spell, and watched as the paladin shrank by half, still formidable, but now awkwardly sized for the crossing. Thomas didn't waste the moment. He muttered something about the adorable little dragonkin, his grin sharpened by fatigue and spite. Zirath didn't rise to it, instead asking if Princess Thomas felt secure in Prince Zora's arms. The tone was calm and to Thomas frustratingly stoic. Zora let out a short, low snicker. Thomas muttered something inaudible and did not continue the conversation. With everyone safely across, the group stepped into the next corridor, the glow of the acid pit flickering behind them. The final barricade was already broken when they reached it, twisted steel plates bent outward, scorched and blasted from within. Beyond it lay a wide chamber, cavernous and quiet, its air stale with stillness and the faint tang of rusted iron. The design spoke of ceremony, tiered walls, collapsed benches, vaulted ceilings darkened by smoke. It had once been an audience hall. But the attention fell to the floor. Gears, plates, bolts piled deliberately. Each mound was crowned with a golden gear, polished and shaped like a headstone. There were dozens, maybe more. None marked by names, but all clearly intended as graves. In the centre, slumped against a cracked pillar, sat a single figure. Small, armoured. Bones wrapped in scorched leathers and plated sleeves. One leg was bent at an unnatural angle. A steel plate was clutched to his chest, hands locked around it in rigour. They moved carefully. No signs of movement. No traps, no ticking mechanisms. No signs of lingering enchantment. Just silence. Zirath stepped forward, knelt and gently pried the plate free. The writing etched into the metal was precise, burned into the surface. It repeated in 4 scripts: Common, Gnomish, Elven, and Orcish. She read aloud to the group the last inscription of Werris Waldor, apprentice tinker. We have barricaded the Master's Hall. We cannot stop them. All night they rip, pry and scratch in the dark. We've sabotaged the boilers. The weapons research is locked. Our kaboom crates guard the boilers. We've sent our last masters, scattered them across the world. Master and apprentice will pass the knowledge. They will remember. The soulbound are coming. The soulbound are coming. The words were carved with urgency and a trembling hand. Friz read it twice, then once more before transcribing it carefully into her journal. Zirath said nothing until the others had stepped back. Then, with quiet finality, he noted aloud that somewhere in this ruin, perhaps still untouched, there was weapons research. They left the room in silence, disturbing nothing, passing again through the broken threshold of the last stand. No one touched the graves as they turned back the way they came. They retraced their steps, returning through the twisted passageways and over the acid-veined bridge, passing again the ruins of the steam room and the deactivated Helpy Helpers who had left more bruises than memories. The path brought them back to the vast steel plaza at the complex's heart. This time they followed the red pipes. The hall ahead was clearer than those they had taken before. No piles of bodies, no collapsed barricades, only the quiet hum of distant machines and the steady glow of red conduit lines tracing the floor and ceiling. Where other routes had been sealed, this one remained open, though both side corridors had collapsed into mounds of impassable debris. Whatever lay ahead was the only direction left. The deeper they went, the more the architecture began to change. The stonework was less refined. Tool marks gouged the walls in uneven lines, and many of the metal supports had yet to be plated or fully set. The girders jutted from the floors at odd angles, and the ceiling dipped lower than the main halls. This section was still under construction when everything stopped. At the end of the corridor they came to a door, or what passed for one. No elegant archway or fortified bulkhead this time. Just a slab of steel, half welded into the frame, wide enough for a gnome, barely. There was no handle. They ducked through, crawling on hands and knees, or simply stooping low in Frizz's case. The room beyond was broad and raw, strewn with half-chiselled stone and slabs of untouched earth. Great machines on wheels stood frozen in place, some still ticking faintly, their gears in motion despite the centuries. Then something shifted, and a pile of scrap in the far corner stirred, gears rolling free, crushed plates clattering to the floor. The noise echoed. A second later, the pile began to rise, slowly, methodically, as chunks of twisted girders slid off its shoulders. What emerged was massive. It stood 3 times Zora's height, its arms thick as siege beams. One hand gripped a rusted girder like a club. Its torso was layered in overlapping plating, heavy and reinforced. Its face was nothing but a flat steel mask, but its eyes lit in sequence, yellow, red, blue, and its voice rumbled out in flawless, unfeeling cadence. Intruders detected. The bendy bender turned to face them and sprung to war. It grabbed a half-ton stone like it was a loose sack of grain and hurled it across the room. The air cracked with the force of it. The adventurers scattered, but not all fast enough. Shards of rock exploded on impact, slamming into shoulders and ribs with a dull, ruinous crunch. And then, as if adding insult with protocol, the ancient enchantment nested in its frame chimed politely.
Please stand clear of the flying debris.
It turned to retrieve another slab. The Heckfire Club didn't wait. They had been fighting as a unit for nearly a year now, and their experience and skill shone that day. Thomas raised a hand and released a blast of synaptic static, a shimmer of psychic pressure detonating mid-air. The spell wasn't meant for machines, but something in its gears jolted. The bender's movements grew sharp, staggered, uncalibrated. Zora and Celia closed in. Friz muttered quick incantations to empower her allies. Zirath moved to intercept, but was too late. The second stone sailed across the chamber, smashing directly in front of a diving Zirath's. He braced, arms up, taking the full brunt in place of Friz, who had been seconds from catching it herself. True to the tinker's word, the fearsome repurposed bendy bender would not fall easily. In the chaos of battle, someone shouted that they needed to bring it down. Zora spotted chains, thick, rusted lengths of reinforced steel, hanging from a dormant crane. Without a word, he dashed for them. Zirath muttered a single word of power, haste, and the magic surged through him like lightning in blood. He vanished in a blur, crossing the chamber in seconds. The bender stood straight, and again the voice returned.
Please stand clear of the venting steam.
Jets of pressurized vapor emanated all around the unit, from vents across its steel body. Celia, Zora, and Zirath recoiled, skin blistering under the boiling spray. Zirath didn't flinch. He pulled his bow free and fired. The enchanted arrow struck true, embedding deep into the machinery, and from it, Razorvine erupted. The metal shrieked as the vines twisted around its legs, clutching the bender in place. It fought, gears grinding violently, but the vines held. Celia was already moving. She sprinted up a ramp of fallen debris, launched into the air, and focused her power into her foot, landing square on the bender's chest. With a shout, she pushed off and rolled backward as the momentum tipped the massive machine off balance. The floor shook as it collapsed. Steam vented again, the bender downed, tangled and furious, but not yet defeated. Zora arrived with the chains in hand. He roared, wild magic sparking along his arms, dashed forward and hurled the glyphed wrench Kolbra had entrusted him. Zirath caught it and wasted no time. Still supernaturally quick, he dashed through the brambles, ignoring the cuts that opened along his arms and legs. He reached the fallen construct and climbed onto its back as it began to thrash. With both hands, he slammed the wrench into a central plate and turned. Something clicked. The hatch opened. And inside, spinning, glowing, fighting against containment, were the fabled and whirring MacGuffin gearboxes. He pulled, the gears resisted, then 2 gearboxes came free. The moment Zirath leapt clear, the bender roared to life. The vines tore, the ground buckled beneath its weight, and it rose, girder in hand. They didn't wait. The group fled the chamber, sprinting for the narrow tunnel behind them, chased by thunderous steps and a mechanical voice that had never once raised its volume.
Please stand clear of the flying debris.
Behind them, a crash of stone echoed down the corridor, which for Thomas, Friz, and even Zirath at that point would have been a killing blow. In a flash, they'd downed the legendary machine and secured the gearboxes. Let it be said, fellow adventurers, that in the hectic, deadly combat that unfolded, even the gods might say, the Heckfire Club was a sight to behold. Returning through the unfinished thoroughfare, their bodies ached. Magic reserves were thin, and the toll of the kaboom crates, helpy helpers, and the colossal bendy bender clung to each of them. Still they pressed on. Healing spells were exchanged. Zora uncorked a potion and drank it in a single motion, while Celia laid hands where the burns still lingered. Friz used what she had left of her arcane focus to dull the pain. It would have to do. They turned their attention to the final lead, the blue pipes. Marked in the inscription from the Master's Hall, and still humming faintly with residual power, they followed the trail into a corridor choked with debris. The walls bent inward unnaturally, forming a bottleneck. Zirith studied the scene and remarked that the automatons laying broken in the narrowing passage indicated some kind of bottleneck was formed here. By Celia's count, it was closer to hundreds. Scraps of silver-scorched armour, shattered joints, all crushed beneath the weight of battle. The implication struck hard. These hadn't been soldiers, not in the traditional sense. They were cannon fodder, disposable units controlled by a distant hand. Whatever intelligence had guided them was not present now, but had callously compelled them forth into slaughter. They pushed forward, stepping over splintered limbs and crushed power cores, until the path narrowed again, this time into a tight hall with a chemical sting in the air. The smell was familiar. Acrid acid vented from the walls in sudden bursts, jets hissing out of corroded pipes with irregular rhythm. The tunnel hadn't collapsed, intentionally so, but it had been turned into a gauntlet, one meant to kill, not block. Someone in the party floated an idea, and soon they were strapping on bits of shattered armour from fallen constructs. Plates and bracers, pauldrons and chest guards. It would slow them, but not everyone had the reflexes of a monk or the unnatural grace of an armoured paladin under spellcraft. They moved. The acid hit hard. Singes and scalds marked their path, but the plating held better than expected. The steam thickened, and the corridor stank of metal and old poison, but step by step they pushed through, crouched low, shielding one another. Then the smoke cleared. Ahead stood a red door, faded but intact, and beside it, a red switch embedded into a control panel. The familiar red pipes led directly into its frame, humming faintly. A simple flick of the switch opened the door. Zora let out a dry laugh and muttered that it was a damned good thing they'd activated the boiler room earlier. Otherwise, they would have had to turn back empty-handed and try again. They stepped inside. Weapons research was cleaner than the rest of the compound. Machines still hummed softly, lights blinked in strange rhythms, and though most racks and armories were empty, the aura of function remained. It was less a vault than a lab. A quick search revealed something promising. Friz found a cache, small canisters, metallic and rune-marked, each about the size of her palm. The schematics nearby were damaged, but enough remained to infer their purpose. She inferred they were not purely spells but enchanted devices. When triggered, they would project a protective dome anchored to a point on the ground. Not a standard shield spell effect, but regionalized. She couldn't read the glyph work, but she copied them anyway. The party felt they might make good use of these drop shields when the time came. With their find secured, they strapped their makeshift armour back on and braved the acid tunnel once more. The return was no easier, but they had the route memorized now, knew where to pause, where to brace, when to run. By the time they emerged back into the larger halls, they were scorched and coughing, but victorious. They made their way back to the Tinker's lab without incident. When they arrived, Shelbert Colbert didn't notice them at first. He was hunched behind his desk, eye pressed to a crystal lens, one hand adjusting the light source, while the other fiddled with dials far too delicate for anyone else to interpret. He jumped when he saw them, gears and coils flying, looking shocked to see them. He then grinned and said coyly that he had something to show them. We end our tale today with the party having survived a dungeon delve into the Tinker's lost empire, loot in hand. Until next time, fellow adventurers.